Okay, this is the second lecture for climate and biomes. When we are looking at biomes, there are three major things you need to take note of: temperature, precipitation, and whether we are looking at a biome in the northern or the southern hemisphere. These three things will tell you so much about what to expect and where to expect it. So let's just take a few moments to consider the impacts of these three things. So looking at our major influencers of biomes, our hemisphere, precipitation, and temperature, let's consider each one and what they contribute to the mix, going in order of importance from least important to most important. So we're going to start at the bottom. First of all, when you are looking at a climograph in particular, this is where this one will become important, is which hemisphere is your location in? Is it in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere? Now, that really doesn't make a huge difference to your biome, but it does make a difference when you're trying to read a climograph. Because if you pay attention to what months of the year your location is getting colder temperatures and what months of the year is getting warmer temperatures, that's going to tell you basically where you're looking at on the planet, which hemisphere, because our seasons are reversed. So what we want to do is look at where our maximum and minimum temperatures throughout the year and tell from there which hemisphere we're in. Next up, we have precipitation. This is quite a bit more important because the amount of precipitation that you get is going to determine what type of plants grow in that biome. You need to ask yourself, are we getting lots of moisture that would support a lot of plant growth, a lot of different varieties? Are we getting moderate amount of moisture? So, slightly less plants, slightly less variety, but still a decent amount of vegetative cover. Or are we looking at a place that's really, really dry, doesn't get much precipitation, so it really can't support a lot of plant life? And then to temperature, this is our biggest one. This is going to be our primary control. And what's our most important influence on temperature? Aside from incoming solar energy, because we got to have that to have a temperature in the first place. But what controls that? Latitude. Because we are going to get different parts of the planet are heated differentially. So we have areas of the planet that are very cold, areas of the planet that are very hot, some that are cool to warm. And beyond that, we also kind of want to pay attention, especially on the climographs, to what our temperature range is. How big of a spread are we seeing between the maximum and minimum annual temperatures in that region? This can help us walk our way through a climograph and explain to ourselves what the heck kind of biome it is we're looking at. So to get us all geared up and ready to go, we're going to start with our good old climate Earth diagram. When we talk about biomes, we have basically four groups: low-latitude biomes, mid-latitude biomes, and high-latitude biomes. We also have a fourth group. Those are biomes that occur at all latitudes. We will look at those at the very end of this chapter. Off to your left here, I have a word bank of different temperature ranges. I shouldn't say that, different temperatures, and also a note on which has the widest temperature range. We're going to go through and fill out our little globe here to help remind you, just in case you have forgotten, which I'm sure you haven't, what type of temperatures we can expect at what locations on the planet. So we're going to start off with the hot temperatures. Where would you expect to find hot temperatures on your planet? At low latitudes, between 0 degrees and 23.5 degrees north and 0 degrees and 23.5 degrees south, our tropics. Why? Well, because this is where we receive the most solar energy on the surface of the planet. Remember, we've got that subsolar point is going to migrate between that 23.5 degrees north and south throughout the year, but it's never going to go beyond that. So they're getting the most direct rays of the sun. They also have the longest hours of daylight. So this is where we have our excess of solar energy and lots of heat to warm the planet. Now, where do you think you would find the opposite? where would we be most likely to encounter cold latitudes? At the poles. That makes sense. This is where we have a deficit of solar energy coming in. Our angle of incidence is the most diffused. It's spread over the most area, so no one area is getting that much sunlight. We have the shortest hours of sunlight available during the day. So polar regions, that's where we're going to have our high latitude cold biomes. How about cool to warm? And remember, we're talking about cool to warm. Another word we can use to describe that is temperate. This is a temperate climate. Where do you think you would find a temperate climate that has a range between cool and warm temperatures? In the mid-latitudes. This is our temperate zone. So, quick note here, if you are looking at on your exam something that refers to a biome with the word temperate in its name, you know it is occurring in the mid-latitudes, and it has a range of cool to warm temperatures going on. Finally, what about that range thing? Where would you expect to find the greatest temperature range, the biggest spread between the maximum and minimum annual temperatures at a location? Well, it kind of gives you a clue in the name here and the label. We are talking about the mid-latitudes. This is where we get our largest range between highest and lowest temperatures throughout the year. So if you're looking at a climate graph and you see that temperature line, that red line has a big bell curve in it, chances are you're probably in the mid-latitudes. Okay, so we have low, mid, and high biomes. For today's lecture, we are focusing on just the low latitude and mid-latitude climates. Starting with those low latitude biomes. These are those tropical biomes. They occur between the equator and roughly 23.5 degrees north and south. Just said that, the tropics. Knowing what you know about the tropics, what kind of temperature would you expect these biomes to have? Hot. We have 3 low-latitude biomes: tropical rainforests, tropical seasonal forests, and tropical savannas. They are all hot. The one you need to be most concerned about for your exam is the tropical rainforest. So every one of these biomes is hot. What sets them apart is the amount of rainfall they get, which in turn determines the type of vegetation structure that we see at each biome. We will look at each of these biomes in turn and see where they occur on the planet. And you will see that the further we get from the equator, the drier these get. And why do you think that might be? What big climate feature might cause this? Well, if you've been paying attention, you know that what we're talking about is the ITCZ. Because of these locations' position relative to the ITCZ, they will either be wet all or only part of the year. Remember that the ITCZ follows that subsolar point. That's why we have the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer. That's the area that the ITCZ is restricted to. If that location is continually under the influence of the ITCZ, gets it all year long, it's going to be wet all year long. If it's maybe a little further from the equator and it gets part of the ITCZ coverage over the course of the year, it's going to have a wet period and a dry period. There's going to be a whole lot of moisture dumped on it while the ITCZ is there, and not as much once it leaves. It might be in a spot where it's just catching the edge of the ITCZ. Also, again, very distinct wet and dry seasons. It's going to have the dry season and it's still going to have the wet season, but because it's just at the edge of the movement of the ITCZ, it's just not going to be as wet as the other 2 biomes. So This is going to influence the types of plants that grow. Now, due to the climate and the types of plants that grow, we see distinct patterns of human activity in the tropics. Unfortunately, these tropical biomes can be quite fragile, and the activities that occur can have really terrible impacts to the environment. Let's talk about tropical rainforests first. These exist in our most humid lowland tropics. Notice I said lowland. That's going to become an important distinction later on. These have the highest primary productivity of any terrestrial biome on Earth. Basically what that means is they are making plants all the time. Remember in the first lecture, we learned that biomes are defined by vegetative structure, what kind of plants are we seeing and how are they laid out, and that vegetative structure depends on climate. Why is this important? Well, because when we talk about plants, well, actually any organism in general, but mainly plants because they just can't get up and leave if they don't like where they're at, we need to consider the concept of something called limiting factors. Limiting factors are environmental conditions that restrict the growth, distribution, or abundance of plants. These can include things like light, water, nutrient availability, temperature, or space, whichever is in shortest supply relative to the plant's needs. As you can imagine, warmth and moisture are not an issue in tropical rainforests. There are plenty of both of these available to support lush plant growth. But there's a major competition for light. Light is the primary limiting factor for tropical rainforest plant growth, and also the fact that they have, in general, really crummy soils, but we'll get to that. So to deal with this, tropical rainforests have developed a really complex vertical structure of growth to help the different types of plants take advantage of whatever light is available to them. Tropical rainforests also have extremely high biodiversity and animal life, and we got a lot of good relationships between plants and animals that help each other benefit from the resources available. We call these relationships mutualism. This is the plants are helping the animals are helping the plants. It's a win-win for both. I am not going to test you on any of this. This is strictly for your information. What I am going to test you on, however, is where tropical rainforests occur and what are their notable features. Here's a map showing you where tropical rainforests occur on the face of the planet. There will be a map like this for each of the biomes that we go over so you can visualize where those different biomes occur. Tropical rainforests exist exactly where you would expect them to, in the tropics, in the equator. You get constant solar radiation. The climate here is dominated by the ITCZ, so it's always wet, and you have no cold or dry season because this is tropical. It's always hot, it's always wet. Okay, for every biome we go through, we're going to have a climograph and a picture showing you what it would look like. I'm never going to ask you a specific location and say, hey, what biome is that? There's too much. You couldn't remember it. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the climograph, and I'm going to ask you to tell me what biome it is based on the temperature range, and the precipitation patterns that you see in that climograph. It's pretty much just common sense based on what you're learning today and what you've already learned throughout this course. That's why I said in the last lecture, don't try to memorize these different biomes and everything associated with them because it's just too tough. Just look at the graph and try to use your brain to think of what that region that the climograph is showing you, what it will look like based on its temperature, its precipitation, and precipitation patterns, and that temperature range. And here's our first climograph. Let me take it just a second to remind you how everything works. We have our months of the year at the very bottom of the graph along the x-axis. We will have temperature on one y-axis and precipitation on the other y-axis. That red line that you see at the top there represents your temperatures. The blue bars represent precipitation. Something that a climate graph also typically provides is the geographic coordinates of whatever location you're looking at. If you look over here at your left-hand side in the upper corner there, you will see that the region we are looking at here is at 5.6, it looks like, degrees north. 5.6 degrees is not very far off the equator. The temperature here, look at your red temperature line, rarely gets below 80 degrees all year round. And notice how flat that temperature line is. This is telling you that really this location, its relationship to the sun never changes. The only place that happens is in the tropics. Once again, notice that the temperature line is flat. This is also a super good indication of where you're going to find the area you're looking at, the area that that climate graph is showing. If you're seeing a very flat line, it means we're not seeing a big variation between wintertime and summertime temperatures. So first thing you can think is tropics. Then just be sure to check at the temperatures too. So here we've got a diagram of the typical tropical rainforest structure. And looking at this diagram, you can kind of understand why light is such a big limiting factor. We've got some different layers going on in the rainforest. We have an emergent layer at the top. That's where one of those trees is poking way above the other trees. The other trees just below it have formed what we call the canopy. This is basically a complete blanket formed by all the leaves off of these trees. And that's really not letting a whole lot of light through to the two bottom layers of the rainforest, the understory, which is just below the canopy, and then the forest floor. So as you get closer and closer to the forest floor, there is less and less light available to those plants. It might be surprising to you considering how beautiful and lush and green we think of tropical rainforests being, but they generally have pretty lousy soils. We call these rainforest soils oxysols or laterite soils. We're focusing on climate. We're not going to focus on soil here, but if you find this interesting, and it is pretty interesting, take Geography 2051. The reason their soils are so bad is because of the constant nonstop rain. This causes a lot of leaching of nutrients out of the soil. So yeah, they might have some nutrients in there to begin with, but that rain is always like leaching it away, and it's flowing out to rivers, getting flushed out to the ocean, leaving these soils very depleted nutritionally. Basically, the only thing that's saving them in the Amazon rainforest in South America is, remember we talked about the Saharan air layer and that big clouds of dust that come across from Africa. That actually brings in some extra nutrients to help replenish that soil, but it's still not great. As a result, the soil in most areas of the tropical rainforest needs to be modified a whole bunch to support farming. Now in the Amazon, traditionally how this has been done is something called slash and burn agriculture, and this has gone on for a really long time. What this is the farmers, the people who live there, who would like to farm, come in, they cut down a section of the forest, and then they set fire to everything they've cut down. They're left with a bunch of a really nice, rich biochar that they can then till into the soil to help enrich that soil and support more of the agricultural crop that they're going to grow. Our one exception to those universally lousy rainforest soils is in the Indonesian rainforest. This is because that area gets a lot of volcanic goodies from nearby. Now I'm going to bring back our map for a second. If you look over just to your north of Australia, those little patches of green, that is the Indonesian region. This area is smack dab on top of a whole bunch of geologic tectonic plates that are constantly moving. It's in that Pacific Ring of Fire area there. And this means that they constantly, I don't know, not constantly, but they get a lot of volcanic activity. We get actual volcanic eruptions that come out. They spew a bunch of volcanic ash, and then we get volcanic flows. And when this breaks down, it gives them a really nice iron-rich soil that is fantastic for growing. Now, a few slides back, there was something mentioning the human footprint. Rainforests are very ecologically complex biomes. It's taken a really long time to develop this fabulous network of relationships of the different components of the rainforest. And because of that, they can be disturbed very easily and cause a downward environmental spiral. The biggest human footprint in rainforests is from forestry. We take rainforest trees, a whole lot of them, and we do it really, really quickly. Some of the lumber from these rainforest trees is really, it's beautiful, exotic wood that we like to use a lot in cabinetry, in furniture making, in paneling, all kinds of things. It's beautiful. So we go through a lot of it, a lot of trees to get that lumber. You know what else is made with lumber? Toilet paper. If you did not know it, toilet paper is made from wood pulp. A lot of that wood pulp is coming from rainforest trees. So just to put this in context for you, you might be basically wiping your butt with an endangered species. I am not against forestry at all. Where I come from, a large part of our economy is supported by the timber industry and logging. I'm also a really big fan of toilet paper. I tell you this to stress the importance of the fact that we get our stuff from somewhere. It doesn't just arrive out of a vacuum. We are extracting everything we use from the environment in some way or another, and we need to be mindful of how we're doing that to help support the health of our different biomes. If you look down at these pictures, we look at this big log truck taking out some big logs. We start with forestry, and then we go into, you'll see the next picture over there is a little example of that slash and burn agriculture that has been traditionally practiced. It's actually not as common today as it used to be because they don't need to do that to clear forests. The forestry is doing that for us. Once they've cleared all those rainforest trees out of the way, we have this flat open land, which then is being dedicated to these gigantic agricultural farms to grow crops, to big livestock ranches, and to putting in more cities, moving more and more people into what was once the rainforest, which is putting even greater stress on the existing rainforest. For the record, between 2000 to 2010, so 10 years' time, an average of over 8,000 square miles of Brazilian rainforest, that Amazon rainforest, was lost every year. That's a lot. Now we are going to move poleward just a little bit from the equator and look at tropical seasonal forests. It's still hot all the time, except now it only rains half the year. Because remember the ITCZ migrates in response to the movement of the subsolar point. So for tropical seasonal, once we get a little bit away from the equator, that ITCZ is coming in and raining in the summer, and then it leaves, and things stay much drier in the winter. Tropical seasonal forests have almost as much biodiversity as tropical rainforests. The notable feature of this biome and where it exists is that you do get some water stress in the winter. And so some fires in wintertime are common. But in general, it's still dominated by the ITCZ. So here's an example of a tropical seasonal climatograph for Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. You can see that the tropical temperature signature line is still really hot all the time, never changes. It has that flat shape to it. But the precipitation bars do change a lot. The precipitation is very low in the winter time. Note that we are in the northern hemisphere, and extremely high in the summertime. This is because as the ITCZ moves into that region, it starts to dump a lot of rain in summer, and then in those winter months, it moves away, taking the rain with it. Then we get to the tropical savanna. This is even further north and south of the equator, and it's quite a bit drier. Tropical savannas are centered around 25 degrees north and south, and these locations lie within the zone where we transition from the edge of the tropics into the subtropical high. So it still remains relatively warm throughout the year. And while the summers are still wet, they're not as wet as the other two biomes. Here you will get forests just very scattered throughout the landscape because there's not nearly enough water to support full forests. What we get is more scattered woody areas with a few trees and lots of grass. This biome is located just outside of the tropical belt. It still receives some rain from the ITCZ in summer, providing a little taste of rain along the edges. However, you experience significant dryness in the winter since the ITCZ moves far away, leaving it more under the influence of the subtropical high. As you can see, there are a couple of different names for this tropical grassland that are used in the different parts of the world. Half of all tropical savanna is found in Africa, where the biome covers about 65% of the continent, and it is a large continent. So here's your standard image of the African savanna. I think it's quite lovely. You have very few trees, a few low-growing shrubs, but mainly grasses, because there's just not enough precipitation throughout the year to support anything greater than that. The climograph we're looking at here is for Gaborone, Botswana in the southern hemisphere. Do note that, though, that it is the southern hemisphere so that our seasons are reversed. Because you're a little further away from that equator, you're actually at almost 25 degrees south here in Gaborone, you do see a change in temperature. But the coldest temperatures in this are just not that cold. So pay attention to the range. It only decreases by a little bit, and that's saying something. If you were really changing temperature, that would mean that you were higher latitude, because that's where those temperature ranges tend to increase quite a bit. And you're going to see a much bigger temperature change at higher latitudes. Looking at this climograph, and I really want to point this out here, notice that it gets colder in July and August. Looking at that would be your first clue that we must not be in the northern hemisphere. And how do we know that? Well, because the northern hemisphere gets warmer in July and August. We know this. This is our summer. But for this location, it's getting colder in July and August. So it must be their wintertime. And that means it must be in the southern hemisphere. There's going to be an exam question about this. And this is why I am pointing it out to you now. What I'm going to do is show you a climograph, and I'm going to ask you, how do you know that this location is in the southern hemisphere? And the answer is because it's going to show the temperature getting colder in July and August. So that was it for our low-latitude tropical biomes. Next, we're going to move into mid-latitude and high-latitude biomes. The biggest difference between these two types of biomes, mid-latitude and high-latitude, is that you go from a temperate, mild temperature change, where you have warm and cold temperature at mid-lats, to where you have much colder temperatures all the time in the high-latitude zones. We have 4 mid-latitude biomes. temperate grasslands, temperate rainforests, Mediterranean biomes, and temperate deciduous forests. If you are closer to an ocean, your annual temperature range is going to be a little less dramatic, but it does still get cold in the winter in mid-latitudes and warm in the summer. But as you move further inland, those temperature differences become more pronounced. You will see this in some of the different graphics that I'll show you as we move through the mid-latitude biomes. So our first biome is temperate grasslands. Remember I said if you see the word temperate, you're definitely in the mid-latitudes. So temperate grasslands are not surprisingly dominated by grasses. These are areas that don't have enough moisture to support trees. These areas are in a chronic moisture deficit most of the time, so they experience natural fires, and it tends to have a lot of grazing herbivores. Those two factors keep trees from getting too established. I mean, if you think about it, if you're constantly being burnt down by a fire or getting nibbled to death by critters, you're not going to grow very much. So the temperate grasslands are found in that subtropical high region, mostly between 30 degrees and 60 degrees latitude. Typically in your continental interior, far from the moderating effects of the ocean. Here's a map showing you where you find those temperate grasslands. You have some aridity here, very dry. It's caused by the interior locations and the subtropical high. Almost all of your temperate grasslands are strongly continental and generally in a moisture deficit during almost all months of the year. So it's just too darn dry to support trees. Different geographical areas use slightly different names for their temperate grasslands. We saw this with our tropical savannas as well. If you are in North America, they will be called prairies. In Eurasia, they are called steppes. In South Africa, they are called veldts. And in South America, they are called pampas. Here's a graphic with a lot of grass and no trees. This is in Argentina, in those pampas. The temperature change here is more dramatic now. You definitely see a range of temperatures. Your peaks are nearing 80 degrees, but are not quite that warm. So you're not in the tropical range. The decreases are near 50, so you're not cold, but you are cool. Once again, these are the pampas in Argentina. Also in the southern hemisphere. How do we know that? Well, let's look at our temperature ranges. When are we getting colder? In June, July, and August. So June, July, and August are winter there. We know it's southern hemisphere. You can also see that the precipitation here decreases in winter and increases in summer. As I said, temperate grasslands can go by many different regional names. We also have 3 prairie types in North America. We have tall grass, mixed grass, and short grass prairies. Think for a moment about what the reason might be for seeing these differences in grass types. What would lead to short grasses or bursts of tall grass? Hopefully you said rainfall. The closer you are to the eastern side of the continent, with that maritime tropical air mass that comes in, remember we have the Gulf Stream on the eastern side of the continent, so there's more moisture. As you get closer to the eastern side of the continent, the taller your grasses tend to be, like in eastern Texas. But the further you go west, the shorter the grasses become because it gets drier and there's less rain to support the taller grasses. And depending on what state you're driving through, you might see all 3 types of grasses within a fairly short distance. Next up, we have the Mediterranean biome. The Mediterranean biome is one of our 2 smallest in the mid-latitudes. You could think of it as the winemaking biome because grapes thrive, wine grapes in particular, in Mediterranean climate. This is where most of our good quality wine grapes are grown. What makes it special? Well, the climate set up in Mediterranean biomes is really unique. It's the opposite of most places. They get the rain in the wintertime, not when it's hot, but when it's cold, and their summers are very dry. There are three physical factors that control the main vegetation structure in the Mediterranean biome: droughts, fires, and poor soil. This last one kind of depends on where you're at. In some places in the Mediterranean biome, we've got pretty good soils, but generally they're fairly poor. Mediterranean biomes are centered at about 35 degrees north and south. If you look at this map, you can see how small the area of the planet's surface has Mediterranean biomes. There's very, very limited areas. We have some in the North American continent on the west coast of the United States, quite a few more in the Mediterranean area in Europe, and in a few parts of Africa, and then in a few places in Australia. Each of these places is dominated by the subtropical highs aridity. That they also have cold ocean currents. So in the wintertime near water, they're able to precipitate, but in the summer, the water is too cold to evaporate into that warmer air, and this leads to very, very dry air in the summertime. Here's a climograph for a Mediterranean biome in the northern hemisphere. This is in Africa, Tunisia, Africa, in the upper northern part of the continent. You can see that the precipitation goes down when the summer temperatures go up. This is the opposite of most other biomes. And just a side note here to help put your mind at ease when it comes to how am I going to answer all these questions on the exam. When I give you these different climographs on the test, the answer choices are going to be very different from one another. We're talking dramatically different biomes. So you're not going to have like things that are very, very close together and it's a trick question you're thinking because, hey, it could go one way or the other. No, these are going to be like big differences. That's why I said don't try to memorize the info. There's just too much of it. The best strategy for you going into the exam when we get to these questions on biomes is just cover up those answers. Don't even look at them. Don't let them mess with your head. Just walk through the climograph, looking at the temperature and the precipitation and that temperature range. Imagine what that place would be like based on what you're seeing there. And that's pretty much going to lead you to a clear answer. We have surprisingly high biodiversity, at least among plants, in the Mediterranean biome. I'm not going to ask you questions about the plants because there's just too much to remember. This is just mainly for your information. So because we have such a decrease in precipitation in summertime in this biome, we have a lot of really unique plants. We have endemic plants. Endemism is a term that means that the plants that grow there are native to that area. And really they're restricted to the area where you find them. They don't grow anywhere else because they have specific environmental and climatic needs that are only found in that one area. These are a lot of our Mediterranean biome plants. And it's interesting to note that after the tropical rainforest, the Mediterranean biome is the most vulnerable biome to changes in climate change or being disturbed by people coming in and building around it. They can become endangered quite easily. But because we have that really, really low precipitation in summertime, we have a lot of plants that they have hard, leathery, waxy leaves that are adapted to reduce water loss and to kind of dissuade herbivory. They are making themselves very unpleasant to the critters who would like to come and eat them. Another unique characteristic of the plants in the Mediterranean biome is that a lot of them are really fire adapted. They are not easily hurt by fire. Some of the plants, like especially some types of coniferous trees and shrubs, they need periodic fire to come by and burn the seeds that they drop to release those so that they can actually sprout. It's kind of cool. That was it for the Mediterranean biome. Now we are looking at temperate deciduous forests. This is actually what we have here in Louisiana. Temperate deciduous forests occur at mid-latitudes where the annual temperature range gets to be pretty large. Our winters here in Louisiana do have below freezing temperatures. I mean, we just don't get a whole lot, but you do get more of those really colder temperatures as you move further north. A lot of our trees lose their leaves through abscission. This is just a fancy, pretentious word that means they cut their leaves loose. If you think about it, we do lose a lot of leaves here in Louisiana. Not all of them, but some of them, because many of our trees are deciduous. Here's a map of that spatial distribution of temperate deciduous forests across the face of the planet. The mid-latitudes get wintertime storms because of the subpolar low, and we get summer thunderstorms because it's hot. Cold winters and warm summers make fall colors. And here are some of those pretty fall colors here. What we're looking at here is a climograph of Chattanooga, Tennessee. In this forest, you would expect to see a fair amount of precipitation all the way through the year, and you do. It's not a lot compared to the tropical rainforest, but it's pretty much year-round. You know this isn't tropical anyway because that red line changes so much. There's a pretty big change of temperatures between maximum and minimum. It peaks at about 85 degrees in the summer, and it gets as cold as freezing in the wintertime. And then our last mid-latitude biome is the temperate rainforest. Temperate rainforests are geographically limited, and they're only where we have a lot of water and a cool climate. And so they only exist on the western coasts of continents, pretty much just to the north of where you would find those Mediterranean biomes. This is where you will find those huge redwood trees you have heard of. Maybe some of you have visited them. They're fairly impressive. Now we're looking at the temperate rainforest's very narrow place on the planet. We only get temperate rainforests where the climate is cool and you have orographic precipitation happening. So they occur where you have a low-lying coastal cold current and any amount of windward precipitation that the subpolar low can bring in. You get mild winters and cool summers. Here is a climograph showing what you would typically see for a temperate rainforest. This particular climograph is for Vancouver in British Columbia, Canada. Vancouver's at about 49 degrees latitude, so you're getting closer to the Arctic Circle. The maximum temperatures here don't quite reach 70, and the minimum temps stay relatively mild, and they don't dip below freezing. That's because you're close to the ocean. You do see a decrease on this climograph in precipitation in summer, but it does still rain, and that's important. There's a lot of it in winter, and this is enough to really help support that temperate rainforest. And just a side note here, I don't know why they chose this particular photograph to show you how big these trees get, because this is not that impressive of a tree. When we're talking about the really big trees that grow in your temperate rainforest, typically these are going to be coastal redwoods or sequoias. So I'm sorry, but this tree just isn't that impressive. This is an impressive tree. This is the General Sherman tree, a giant sequoia. in the giant forest of Sequoia National Park in Northern California. The General Sherman tree is the largest tree by volume on the face of the planet. It's about 274 feet tall, so there are actually taller trees, most of them also sequoias. And it's not the oldest, but it is close to 3,000 years old, they estimate. So I'm going to leave you with this lovely view of these two humans staring up at this incredibly impressive tree and close out our section on mid-latitudes. Next up, we're going to look at those high latitude biomes and biomes that occur at all latitudes.